Hi, I'm Mira. Thanks for the introduction. So, until July, I was working at ASB, and today's presentation is mostly my experience of working in the mobile team as part of ASB Digital. I'm currently working as a senior consultant at ThoughtWorks, and now I live in Melbourne. So I thought I would just let you know that I don't work at ASB anymore. And of course, I don't represent neither of my employers. So I thought I wanted to share a little bit of background of the team at ASB and how it worked, to give you a bit more context of where I'm coming from. And obviously I'm talking about the reusable UI components as well as SwiftUI. So I guess you could see that there's two parts to my talk. So how we work was that we had a Fortification Transformation. So it's part of a popular model of Agile where you have various squads or teams working per feature or experience. And there'll be frequent releases every 2 weeks, and each of the team would decide what release schedule they want to go in and schedule their own items. So this was all good, following the modern Agile. However, our code base was not quite set up for that. So we had this legacy code base, which was a giant monolithic app. And in terms of the UI, since I'm talking about UI, we had a single storyboard. We haven't managed to split that into multiple yet, and had over 50 screens in there, which was a total nightmare, as you can imagine. And most of our UI was built with interface builder, nib files, combination of things, and coding customization sprinkled on top. So even the same things like colors or animation, things like that would be some places would be defined in code, some would be in the nib files, and so on. So you can imagine that having 10 plus teams merging into a single code base with independent timelines would often cause this kind of merge conflict. So it was really clear that we had to do something about it, and that was let's do UI by code. So normal storyboard, we're going to write all of the new things in code. And this was a very difficult thing to do. A lot of resistance from the developers, because programmatic UI before SwiftUI was a pain. It was really difficult. It was really slow. We were using the UI kit, the built-in UI framework, with a third-party tool called Snapkit, which helped us write the constraints in a more meaningful way. But it was still really slow, a lot of code, a lot of boilerplate, and most of all, no real-time preview. So this meant that you would spend a whole lot of time writing code, and then you can only verify after you run them. And the SwiftUI came along. I was super excited at the WWDC announcement. Unfortunately, at this point, we have already built all of our components in UI. But anyhow, I thought it was a really a major game changer in terms of UI. And I'll show you why. SwiftUI builds UI with less code. And I think that's definitely the biggest selling point. It uses declarative Swift syntax, seamless integration with Xcode, so it's not some third-party tool. It's built right into Xcode. And most of all, it has automatic support for dynamic type, dark mode, localization, and accessibility. So I thought I'll show you an example rather than giving you all the words. So if we wanted to build a simple component with the image and two text labels and the icon on the right, if you had to write it in code before SwiftUI, this is something you would write something like this. So this is for a single image view on the left. We create an image view, we specify the size, and then we go border width, mask bounds true, blah, 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 color radius, ellipse bounds true. So unless you actually knew what you're talking about, reading this wouldn't really mean a lot. And also, there's no way for you to test whether this is correct until you then add this to the view by add subview. You define all of these constraints, and then run in the simulator, cross fingers, it's going to show up, and it's going to look like whatever I thought it would look like. And if it doesn't, then you have to go through the whole thing again. Whereas with SwiftUI, you only need 5 lines of code, and they actually make sense. You can read through and say, OK, so this is frame with width, height, alignment to center, clip shape to circle, and overlay circle with the stroke, color black, line width. So even I wrote this myself, but I can come back to it and understand what I've written, whereas the previous one, I would need to actually think about it. So we're going to do a quick demo, and we're going to try and build this component. OK. So one thing to note is SwiftUI is only fully supported in Xcode 11 beta, and you can still use it in Xcode 10, but the canvas view, which we'll see shortly, only works in the Xcode 11. So here we're going to go new file. Here you might have noticed there's a new thing called SwiftUI under user interface. We're going to select that one and call it landmark item. Now is the, can everybody see the code? Yep. So you might have noticed that there's blank space on the right. This is a canvas view. And this works very similar to Playground if you've used Playground before. So they give you some example here already, Hello World. Now we're going to change this to Hello Dev World. You can see that as you're typing, the preview on the right is changing dynamically. So I'm going to create a new image. And of course, before I do that, I'm going to embed this in horizontal stack. So one thing about the SwiftUI is they really make use of the stack views, and majority of the views are horizontal stack view or vertical stack view. OK. So I've prepared the image called Flinders Station with the name Flinders. And I'm going to move that inside here. So this is basically image UI, image named name. So that's just a simplified. We're going to make that resizable. And I hope this is still working. OK, so my syntax completion is not really working. This is not great. OK, so I'm going to cheat and go to the demo finish, because I don't trust myself to type out everything without syntax auto-completion. So let's pretend that I've written that live. And there we are. So I'll just show you. Yeah. Promise it would have taken only 5 minutes to do this. So there's image blenders, resizable frame, and you can change these. And let's say your designer comes along and say, hey, actually, we want this image to be larger. Then now we can change this to 120 by 120. And then they might say, oh, can we have the outline gray instead of black? And then you can change the color. We might want to increase the border lining or make it thinner, and so on. So what is really great about this is it has a live preview right on the right, and the other part is when I change from the view inspector, this is actually reflected back to code. So if you're not comfortable with code, you could change things around in the UI view, and that would reflect back to the code, whereas before there was not much, some weak link between the UI interface view to the code. Now they are in sync. Yeah, so that's SwiftUI. So hopefully you're all convinced that SwiftUI is pretty awesome. But newsflash, creating UI component is not just about coding. And no matter how easy it is to write UI really quickly, and you can see all this preview, it doesn't mean that you're going to get good UI components. So I want to share a quick story of our initial attempt of creating UI components. And that was us developers thought that, hey, we want to reuse code. We now have all of these code that's creating UI. We want to share those between the teams. Let's make them into components. That didn't really work well because we're developers and not designers. We decided that everything that looks the same would be the same component. And that turned out to be not true. So a quick example of that is working on the banking app, there are a lot of forms, input fields. It has a label. This label goes up when you enter values. We thought, OK, we can make this into a component. And they would have variations, like this one. When you tap on this, you get the number. This one, you go to another screen. The other things, you would have formatting things. So you might think this is a really simple component. They can be the same thing. Turns out that is not true, because they had very different behaviors. They had different business requirements and validation rules, and so on and so forth. So we have learned that things that look the same are not necessarily the same components. And they really need to come from designers. Designers have to create a component and make sure that they can be reused across multiple screens. The other thing was, of course, coordinating multiple squads with different timeline is really tricky. And most importantly, naming is very important. So we actually got to do proper UI components as part of our redesign project. So this is the new ASB app, and you probably haven't seen the previous one, which I'll show you in a bit, but it looked much worse. So as part of the redesign, a couple of things. Obviously, we wanted to make it look really cool, modern, all these things, but some of the other part was improve accessibility, which, yeah. So, and also the other part was we wanted to get the design spec out of this project. So surprisingly, we didn't really have a proper design spec. We had existing designs, but there were no specs around it. So there were a lot of guessing and inspecting the existing view to figure out what sort of margins and width and so on. So this was the old app, and it looked pretty 1990s. And now this is the new look. So yeah, I mean, us developers were super excited because we got to work with something that looks like 2019. But there were other things like personalization, and the other part was being able to choose the theme of light and dark. So this meant that now we had all these design assets, which were components. They could be reused between different things. We had cool images that we can assign to each account. So even with these awesome design specs and somewhat of collaboration between the teams, we still had challenges like setting up and managing internal library, versioning different components, and of course, when you share things between different teams, you have competing changes. One team wants to change it this way, and then the other team wants to change it that way, and having to manage those was a bit of a challenge. So here are some of the success tips of how to make great UI components between the teams. Versioning is really important. And with Xcode 11, the great news is Swift Package Manager is now integrated. We used to use CocoaPods before, which included some more overhead of maintaining it, and also CocoaPod going ahead and really modifying your project files and all these things, whereas Swift Package Manager is much better. And other things that are not code related are more people side of things, like governance around shared components, having some working group or a group of people who can agree to changes to components. Definition ready, so those of you who are familiar with Agile, there's a concept of definition ready where is something ready for us to develop, and that needed to include UI components. Yeah, and once you get to the coding stage, it's really difficult to change any of the decisions. So hopefully by the time you start coding, all of the decisions and agreements, disagreements have been all done. Visibility across squads and teams is really important, and SwiftUI provides that visibility. And of course, communication is the most important. So for UI components to succeed, collaboration of designers and developers is the key. That's the most important part, as well as collaboration between the teams. But most of all, I think the really great part of SwiftUI is not only about how easy it is to code, but also it's an excellent collaboration tool between developers and designers. Now, designers and developers can actually sit together, go through the code, make changes without having to sit there and wait for the compile to finish. Version control with Swift Package Manager would be an excellent idea. And you can actually use the SwiftUI files as a living document where you can see what the component looks like. There's one other thing that I really wanted to show you, which was the the other part where you can preview the dark mode and text sizes. So let's see if I can do this one. So in the canvas view, and this is really, this comes in really handy when you're testing accessibility. But you can also see the preview of light mode and dark mode immediately. And this is all controlled by this preview code. So this applies for text sizes, and here's a handy little button right at the bottom, right here. And that's called environment overrides. So you can change these things and see what they look like. And also, you can change the text size to see what they look like. And there's these other types of accessibility controls, like bold text. I don't think this one does voiceover, but you can try that with the real device. So some of the challenges we had as part of the redesign project was testing all these accessibility features that we've put in. And when I say accessibility, I don't mean just the voiceovers, but also text resizability and high contrast with people with low visibility. And one of the pain points was we had to run it on the real device, and then you have to go to the settings, toggle settings, and come back and go back and forth, and that was really time consuming. So now with this, you can create a component, test every aspect of it, and use it with the code. So my conclusion of Swift, yes or no? I would definitely lean towards yes. However, there's a very big caveat, which is this only supports iOS 13 or above. Obviously, iOS 13 is still in beta. And if you are working on something like a banking app, you can't just deprecate all the versions. But maybe if you are working on a new app, maybe you can target the latest version. Then this is definitely worth a try. And I'm hoping to see maybe there's some sort of backwards compatibility from Apple. That would be really great. But so far, I think it's definitely worth a try. And yeah, it'll be really exciting. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Mira. We've got time for questions. So does anyone have any questions for Mira?
So in terms of switching between light and dark mode, was that custom control inbuilt, or is that something you've exposed through the operating system to be able to quickly switch?
Yeah, so the question was, did I have to do any custom control to handle the dark mode? And the question is, no, I didn't have to do anything. That's because I've used the semantic naming for the colors and the text, which I haven't really gone through in detail. But if you're starting from iOS 13, there are various things like default background colors and text colors and so on. So if you're using the system default, then those are automatically managed by the switching of dark mode and light mode. And the other thing is you can create your own color sets following those semantic naming, and that would automatically handle the switching of the themes. So that's a really a good way of making your app respond to the dark mode without having to redesign everything.
Rephrase the question.
Yep.
So there was a screenshot that you had which allowed you to show how preview between light and dark mode of your app. Was that something that you had to build?
Oh, the preview.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I did. So I'll just show you that code quickly. So for each of the content view, there's a content preview. And I use this line of environment color scheme with the light and the dark. By default, it'll show you the light one. And there are other things like you can preview different devices as well. So yeah, that's pretty easy to do. Did it answer your question?
I'll speak to you later on.
Okay.
Any other questions at all for Mira? Yes.
Hi. So was your component library, I guess the second attempt, was that a separate framework? And how did you handle like automated testing of that, like unit testing or snapshot testing? What kind of things did you do?
Yeah, so the question was, did we have to create a separate framework for the UI components? And yes, we had to create a separate library using CocoaPod. And we had an example app. And we've actually used the playground to preview the components as we were building them. So in a way, you could use a combination of playground with the code to simulate the SwiftUI if you can't only target iOS 13.
Great. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you, Mira, for that presentation.